Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here, and I want to start by introducing myself. My name is Paul Sirk-Venick. I'm the president of the Minnesota Private College Council. The Minnesota Private College Council is made up of 17 private, nonprofit colleges and universities, including the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. For our member institutions, a deep commitment to liberal arts education is the common bond that brings them together in collaboration through the Private College Council. As a graduate of this St. John's University, it's a personal pleasure and an honor to help welcome you all to the St. John's campus. And as an alum, I'm especially proud that Mary Hinton and Michael Hemisath and their colleges are providing important leadership in stewarding and nurturing the mission and work of liberal education by hosting this conference. Thank you all for being here and for the work you are doing to strengthen liberal arts education at your own institutions. A liberal arts education has many elements and facets, one of which is to help students develop a more informed global perspective and understanding. Global education is something that private liberal arts colleges have been working on and leading in for decades. When I came to St. John's way back in 1977, I didn't really understand what a liberal arts education might actually entail beyond reading at least some of the great books. I never imagined that my education would include study in Greece and Italy, an experience that was an important part of what made my education transformative. But it is fair now to ask, is a study abroad experience, the experience I had decades ago, sufficient today for a liberal education? This evening's plenary speaker, Dr. Adam Weinberg, will speak to the topic of creating a globally engaged campus. Adam is a college leader who is deeply experienced in the work of globalizing higher education. Prior to becoming Denison's president in 2013, Adam served as president and CEO of World Learning, where he led education programs in more than 70 countries. His work at World Learning included overseeing the Experiment in International Living, the School for International Training, and a large portfolio of USAID grants and programs. While at World Learning, Dr. Weinberg concentrated on the internationalization of higher education and also worked on programs for emerging world leaders. In addition, he is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Adam is a sociologist with intellectual roots in civic engagement, civil society, and especially the role of higher education in creating civic agency. At Denison, he is working to bring a new lens to the role of campus life as a site for civic learning and democratic engagement, including a focus on residential life, mentorship, and work in the local community. He works closely with his campus partners and also with other higher education leaders who share his commitment to helping students become equipped for meaningful lives in the 21st century. Among his notable initiatives is a project in collaboration with the Kettering Foundation, whose aim is to identify ways in which colleges can better serve the public purposes, the small d democratic and citizenship purposes of higher education. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Adam Weinberg.
Well, I can assure you I don't get those kinds of reviews at home. It's always nice. I'm going to put my papers where they should be. You know, my wife is always, my best friend, partner, and spouse of 25 years has always teased me that when I get up on a podium, I tend to put my papers everywhere, and I always assure it's not a problem because they're only my papers. Well, we had graduation a few weeks ago, and when I got up here, somebody else's papers were on the podium as well. I had my papers spread out, I gave my remarks, I picked up all the papers and went and sat down. The student speakers then got up and nervously looked for all their papers, which were somewhere in my lap with all my other papers. But being good liberal arts students, they embraced the ambiguity and change, and they read it off their cell phone. It's always fun to be the speaker after the long first day and after dinner. I figure if I can just keep people awake, that will have sufficed as a good outcome. And the lights are so bright I can't see you, so I'm just going to kind of assume that everybody is nodding and enjoying the talk. Actually, what I am going to do is I'm going to try to do two things. I was told that I could speak for 45 minutes. I'm not going to do that. I don't think anybody can stay awake for 45 minutes this time of night. So I'm going to try to keep my remarks to about 25 or 30 minutes, and then do some Q&A. As I learned sitting through some of the sessions today, this is not a group that is shy with questions. The other is I'm going to try to not stand behind the podium the whole time. So I have a 12-page, beautifully written, every word exactly as I want it version of this talk. I'm not going to read that. If anybody wants it, I'm happy to share it with you via email. Otherwise, I'm going to kind of do this a little bit off the top of my head. So let me just kind of start with a confession. I am a product of the liberal arts. I went to an undergraduate liberal arts college. I got my PhD from a liberal arts university. I was a tenure-tracked and then tenured faculty member at a liberal arts college, a department chair, a dean, worked with most of the private liberal arts colleges in the country in my last job on global programs, and now I'm the president of a liberal arts college. So I believe deeply in who we are and what we do, and I've often said that I believe that every person in the world deserves a liberal arts education. My views actually shifted over the last 18 months. I actually now believe the world needs every person in the world to have a liberal arts education. Having said that, I worry about the state of the liberal arts for all the reasons that we talked about today, that you heard about last night, and some more. And in particular, I worry about our value proposition, or at least the perceived value proposition. And what I want to do tonight in about 25 minutes or so is I want to make three arguments. The first is I want to argue that we need to recapture and strengthen our value proposition. The second is I want to argue that globalization, or globalizing the liberal arts, is something that we can do it at scale, we can do it in ways that matter, and most importantly, we can do it in ways that differentiates us from every other kind of liberal arts college that we're competing with and for students, donors, reputation, so on and so forth. And then lastly, I want to spend the bulk of my time laying out a series of principles for globalizing our campuses that I think are both doable and desirable. When I talk about globalizing the liberal arts, the two responses I immediately get are, how would we ever do it at scale, and it's expensive? And I want to kind of take those myths on tonight. And I mean myths in the anthropological sense. They have a basis of truth, but I actually think we can reframe the conversation a little bit. So let me start with the value proposition. Here's the bad news. The bad news is that I think the conference materials we all got were actually right. The materials note, and I'll quote, "The current narrative about the liberal arts is a strong indictment. The liberal arts are a luxury for the wealthy. Liberal arts education teaches an outdated canon with no connection to real life." Now, of course, that narrative's not true, but it is one that I think has gathered a lot of steam over the last 3, 4, 5 years. I'm struck by how often, as a liberal arts college president, I'll sit down at dinner and somebody will look me in the eye and say, "So is the liberal arts still relevant?" I don't ever know how to answer the question other than to say, if I didn't think they were relevant, I probably wouldn't be doing this for a living. So I think that's the bad news. Here's the good news. I actually think we have a much better story to tell than we've been telling. I actually think our value proposition is quite strong. I think it is getting stronger over time, and I think there are things that we can do to make it even stronger. When we talk about value, I think different people measure the value proposition in different ways, right? I think it gets portrayed as a very simplistic calculation, but actually when you sit down and talk to families or alumni or prospective students or foundations and donors, I actually think the calculation is much more complex. But I do think the value proposition revolves around three central questions. The first is, for right or for wrong, more and more people are asking the question about, are we preparing students to be successful in their jobs and careers in the 21st century? Will our students be able to get the jobs they desire, to build the kinds of careers that they want, to build the kinds of lives that they aspire to have? The second is, I think for many more people than we sometimes believe, the value proposition of higher education still revolves around the civic piece of what we do. Is higher education producing the next generation of citizens and engaged civic leaders that this country and every other country are going to need? And then lastly, I think we often undersell parents. When I talk to parents, especially in April, about how they're making those final decisions, I actually think the value proposition, as it's defined by the larger public, is often revolves around meaning. People understand the intrinsic value of an education to allow people to lead more meaningful lives. what I want to argue briefly, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I'm going to assume that this is a friendly audience, and if it's not, people can ask me questions about this. But I think it was actually just articulated quite nicely that adding a global dimension to the liberal arts would dramatically strengthen our value proposition in every way, shape, or form. It is not much of a leap to argue that being globally literate and globally competent opens up endless possibilities for our graduates to add meaning to their lives, from their ability to travel to more interesting places, the expansion of the movies we watch, the books we read, the politicians we follow, the culture we immerse ourselves in. Clearly, global competencies, to being global competent, leads to a more meaningful life. I also think it's a pretty simple and easy argument to make that to prepare our students to be citizens and civic leaders in the time period in which they're going to mature, they're going to have global competencies. All the issues that this generation will face, or most of them, will fall under the category of what political scientists call wicked problems, right? Large, complicated issues like climate change, global pandemics, deeply entrenched ethnic conflicts. All of those issues will need a generation of citizens and civic leaders who can work across cultural differences, who can understand problems in their global, regional, and local ways, who understand and know how to work across disciplines to see old problems in new ways. All of that is fairly easy to articulate. I think the place where we don't make a strong enough argument is that, in fact, even if we reduce the value proposition to nothing more than vocational training, pre-professional training, being globally competent and globally literate is one of the defining skills that will determine whether our students are winners or losers in a rapidly bifurcating job market. It doesn't matter what profession they go into. Cross-cultural competencies and global attributes are growing in importance. From medical professionals who need to work with more diverse patient populations, to businesses that are increasingly expanding into global markets, to managers across every sector who have to increasingly be able to manage diverse work teams, global competencies are important. My point is really simple, that one of the ways I think liberal arts colleges can differentiate ourselves from other kinds of academic experiences is by really globalizing the student experience so that we produce a generation of students who are globally literate and globally competent. Or to put it slightly differently, what I want to argue or what I want to lay out is a vision. And it's a vision for what it would look like if every single one of our graduates graduated globally literate and globally competent. In other words, they knew how to appreciate and navigate cross-cultural differences. They knew how to think and understand about issues in their global context. They had the confidence and experience to embrace ambiguity and change. So how would we actually do that? That's the piece that I want to actually focus on tonight. And what I want to argue is that there's 6 principles that I think should drive globalization on every single one of our campuses. And they're as follows. Globalization has to be woven throughout everything the college does. 2, to be global really means to be global, not just beyond the United States. 3, the global project needs to include every student on our campus. 4th, quality really matters. 5th, assets need to be managed and need to be leveraged so that we can actually do this at scale in ways that doesn't bankrupt our institutions. And finally, leadership matters. So let me talk about each of those. And I want to do that in just a little bit of depth. So I was told to use this mic. If I can figure out how to sit on. Great. So let me talk about each of those separately. First, in order to globalize our campus, globalization has to be woven through everything we do. That may sound commonsensical, but I've done some interesting benchmarking for Denison over the last few months. And I was surprised by a couple things that probably I shouldn't have been surprised by. The first is that many liberal arts colleges remain predominantly non-global. We continue to have anywhere from 3 to 10%, but rarely more than 10% of our student body is international. The argument was made this afternoon that is increasingly hard to do. I actually don't believe that to be true. When I arrived at Denison, we were 6% international. Our incoming class next year will be 18% international. I was actually surprised how easy it was to do it, and probably not surprisingly, the net tuition revenue on our international students tends to be a little bit higher than on our domestic students. But even for colleges that have embraced global, that have added more global students over the last 5, 10, 15 years, I want to argue that if we want to be global, we really got to be global. If you look at the data, 50% of the international students coming to the United States come from two countries. They come predominantly from India and China. I love the Indian students we have on our campus. I love the Chinese students we have on our campus. But I don't think we can call ourselves global if our students come from the United States, India, and China. I actually think to be global, we need students who come from a variety of countries and who come from countries of every part of the world. I would argue the same is true for our faculty. If you look through the catalogs of many liberal arts colleges, what's exciting to see is that almost all of us have more international faculty and more faculty teaching international topics than we had 10, 15, 20 years ago. But it bunches. It tends to bunch in certain academic departments with certain faculty around certain topics. So my fundamental starting place is, if we're going to be global, we actually have to have global things on our campus. We need to have a student body that's more global. We need to have a faculty that needs to be more global. We need to have staff that are more global. And it needs to not bunch in certain countries, in certain disciplines, and in certain topics. We need to ask questions like, what would it mean to add a global dimension to our science departments? What would it mean to add global competencies to our core curriculum, so on, and so forth? Here's the more challenging part. If globalization is going to be woven throughout everything we do, it actually has to be interconnected. And one of the things that I think many liberal arts colleges are really struggling with is, in some ways it's hard to add international components to our campus. It's even harder to make sure that they're integrated. So I'm a sociologist by training. I would like to say I'm an ethnographer by training. That's actually not true. Anybody who knows ethnography, Howie Becker was one of my mentors in grad school, and he would say I was many things but not an ethnographer. But I'm a qualitative sociologist who wished I had the patience to be an ethnographer. But as a president, one of the things I like to do is just kind of stand at various places around campus and watch how students walk around campus. If you do that on just about any single one of our campuses, there's way, way too much parallel play going on. So if we want, just to think about students for a second, if we truly want a global campus, one of the things I want to argue tonight is we don't have to send students abroad to do it. We should be able to do it on our own campuses. And the fundamental starting place is increasing the number of our international students, and most importantly, increasing the interaction between all of our students. So with 17% of our incoming class being international, we've done a lot of work at Denison in the last couple of years looking at residential halls. I continue to believe that when we talk about inclusive excellence and social inclusion, that residential halls continue to be the most under-leveraged place for doing this work on every single college campus in the United States and abroad. And when a student moves into a residential hall on a US college campus, for about 95% of our students, it's the first time they've ever lived in an ethnic or racially diverse neighborhood. Think about that. We have huge opportunities in our first-year residential halls to help students develop a different set of skills, a different set of values, a different set of habits, and to make first-year residential halls a site for international learning. In many ways, as I'll argue in a minute, we could make the first-year residential hall on a college campus the most interesting, most impactful international experience a student has. We could make it more culturally intense than most of the study abroad programs that our students wind up going on. And we could do it in a way that would be revenue positive. But to do that, it requires thinking about things all differently. So one of the things that we've been messaging to our first-year students, and I joke with our first-year students the night before classes start, that I'm going to stop you in the middle of the academic quad, and I'm going to ask you a simple question. First, here's my charge, that I want to ask every incoming student at Denison to make it a point during their first 4 weeks on campus to identify the student in their residential hall whose life experiences are most different than your own and find a way to forge a friendship. My second charge is the first time you hear somebody say something in a classroom that you find deeply politically offensive, take them out for coffee and listen to them articulate their political views. And when I see you on campus, I'm going to stop and ask if you've done those two things. Then students avoid me for about the first 6 months. So my first point is that the globalization has to be woven throughout everything the college does, and that we have remarkable opportunities to do this on our campus by internationalizing our campuses and integrating our global components. The other piece of this is many of us come from colleges that have built really nice global centers over the last decade or so, but I would challenge us to ask the question, are those global centers integrated throughout everything we do, or do they become kind of an isolated place for the few people on campus who are actually involved proactively in international issues? Here's the second. To be global means to really be global, not just beyond the United States. The data, and let's talk about study abroad for a second. The vast majority of our students, their most significant international experience during their time on our campus is their semester abroad. For 54% of all U.S. college students, their study abroad experience consists of going to Western Europe. There's nothing wrong with Western Europe, and you can have a great experience in Western Europe. But I would argue that when we look at the national data and it doesn't change, and we are continuously sending 54% of our students to Europe, only 4% of our students to China, 1% of our students to India, I'm not sure we should be calling that global education. I think we need to call it Western education, Western Europe education. My point being that to be global, it can't just be beyond the United States. And I think this work is hard, and I think it's going to force us to rethink the globalization project in a couple different ways. And let me give you two examples. Both of these are things that during my time at SIT, when these issues were being talked about, I was very resistant to them, and I will now stand up here with a mic and say I was absolutely wrong. The first is the concept of study away. I've come to believe really deeply that we could globalize the experience of most of our students within a 2-hour drive of most of our campuses. So I'll talk about Denison for a second. Denison sends about 50% of our students abroad each year. On the one hand, that's great, but that means that 50% of our students are not studying abroad at any point during their college career. It also means that for the vast majority of our students, they continue to have one experience, and it tends to be focused highly in Western Europe. On the other hand, we are 25 minutes, well, we're 30 minutes from downtown Columbus. 25 minutes of our students are driving. Downtown Columbus has a thriving Somalian population. Downtown Columbus has a rapidly expanding, really interesting Middle Eastern population. The same is true, I would expect, for any school, for any one of the colleges that's within an hour or 2-hour drive of Minneapolis or any other major city in the country. I've actually come to believe that study away may give us more opportunities to give more of our students an international experience on a more regular basis. And as I want to argue in a minute, perhaps even in a more deeply cultural way. Or to put it differently, I grew up in Texas. I think it is both cheaper and easier in many ways to put students on planes and to send them to El Paso than it is to many of the places that they study abroad. And for many of our students, spending a week or 2 weeks doing a homestay in El Paso would be a deeply, globally enriching international experience. So the first is, I think the concept of study away for all of us who are thinking about how do we really do this at scale so 100% of our students are having multiple international experiences at each phase of their educational experience, and how do we do this in ways that truly exposes them to a multiplicity of cultures around the world. Study away within 2 hours of our campus may provide a really interesting strategy. Here's the other piece, which is technology. I am in my 50s. I don't use technology very well. I have to ask my kids the difference between Instagram and Snapchat and why one would use one and not the other. But I'll tell you what, you want to see somebody who's just hot-wired to use technology, give an app to my 12-year-old. And she doesn't have to read the instructions. She just intuitively gets it. The ability of the generation of students we have and those coming behind them to use new technologies to actually build meaningful relationships is something I didn't think was possible a decade ago, but my mind has been changed. And we've been doing a lot of interesting work in the GLCA, the Great Lakes College Association, using linked classes where our faculty are teaching their own classes. It's too hard to try to coordinate the same class in 3 different continents. They're teaching different classes, but those classes are intersecting at certain points around common assignments, and our students are having really, really culturally rich, intellectually stimulating, global kinds of experiences. So my second point is to be global means to really be global, and all this suggests a need to refine the global. It's not about travel. It's not about how far we go in an airplane. It's about the experiences we give our students and the opportunities they have to explore a range of cultures and attributes in ways that helps them develop the skills, values, and habits of working effectively in global ways. Here's my third principle. It's one I've hinted at already, which is I think to truly globalize our campuses, we actually need to take this to scale. We need to make sure that every single student on our campus has multiple international experiences. And I worry about this in a variety of different ways. One of them was mentioned this afternoon, which is also true for study abroad. I worry that study abroad continues to be predominantly more women than men. It tends to skew by different race, class, and ethnic categories. I think if we believe in study abroad, college presidents and others need to make sure that it's open to every single student on our campus. But the other is, even colleges that are at the high end of the spectrum of helping students study abroad still have large percentages of students who aren't studying abroad. And I think we need to recognize for the vast majority of our students, especially those who grew up in the United States, they did not grow up, many of them, in communities that appreciate global education. And so they don't necessarily come to college with an appreciation of the importance for it. And so I think we have to find ways to make sure that all of our students have global experiences and that they can't opt out. And I think doing that's going to require starting on our campuses with things like residential halls, making sure we take advantage of what's in our local communities or within a 2-hour drive, taking advantage of technology, and making sure that study abroad is affordable for all of our students. Fourth principle, quality really matters. Some of you may have seen this, but there was an interesting back and forth in Inside Higher Ed a couple months ago. The last article was published by George Koo and Gillian Kinsey. And what Koo and Kinsey state, the debate was really over whether or not high-impact practices matter. And there's been some new data out that suggested that some of the high-impact practices that people like me tout don't always produce the outcomes that we think they're going to. And Koo, to his credit, came back and said, I thought quite succinctly, simply offering and labeling an activity as a high-impact practice does not necessarily guarantee that students who participate in it will benefit in the ways that much of the literature claims. Over the past few years, we've emphasized the implementation quality is critical in terms of realizing the benefits of high-impact practices. This is not a surprise, as the caveat applies to every effort of a college or university makes to engage students in meaningful, relevant learning experiences inside and outside the classroom, on and off campus. In other words, quality matters regardless of what we're talking about. So let me talk about internationalization for a minute. There are many, many, many different ways to develop international programs, to think about internationalizing our campus. As somebody who ran SIT, a large study abroad provider, for 8 years, I at first was very excited about and then became somewhat skeptical of the claim often made by students when they come back from a study abroad experience. It was the most remarkable experience of my life. It changed my life. I think that is true in many respects, but I also think travel's really fun. It's really exciting. Being away is really engaging. Whether or not that translates into the kind of deep learning outcomes that we aspire for our students to achieve, I think is more complicated. Here's what I have come to believe. For international experiences to matter, for global literacy to really, and competency to really emerge, 2 factors have to be embedded in every global program, I believe, that we develop. The first is deep cultural immersion, and the second is it's got to have academic rigor. Let me talk about the first. There are no panaceas in education, but during my time at SIT and now as a college president, I have come to believe that homestays, living for a period of time in a family that hopefully doesn't share your common language, but certainly sees the world and acts in the world in a different way, can be an incredibly powerful experience in multiple ways, one of which is just giving young people the confidence that they can actually learn languages and that they can find their way through challenging cultural contexts. I want to go back to something I said a minute ago. One of the things I've been thinking about at Denison is I would love to send every single one of our students on a semester-long study abroad program that had a deep homestay experience. That's probably not likely to happen at any point in the near future for a whole lot of reasons. Part of it financial, part of it is just student choice. But I've begun to kind of look at Columbus 30 minutes away and to think about why couldn't we be taking students 30, 40, 50 at a shot and do 3-4 day homestays with the Somali community in Columbus? Why couldn't we be taking students for brief periods of times to go do homestays on all of our borders in the United States or communities that are really different? So the first is homestays and the real value of a homestay. The second is just academic rigor. And I'm going to imagine in this audience, I don't need to defend that, but I truly believe that especially if we take a look at some of the programs our students are going on, many of them have a lot of academic rigor, but some maybe not as much as we want. So let me make 2 final comments, and I want to kind of bring it together. My fifth principle is that assets need to be leveraged effectively if we want to take this to scale. And that's going to vary across campuses. But I've begun to kind of think a lot about if my fundamental premise is we want every single one of our students to graduate with global competency and global literacy, and we want to do that for 100% of our students, How would we take that to scale? I think it will vary for every single one of our campuses. But when I got to Denison, I challenged a group of our staff to really think through what that would look like by just starting with a simple question, which is, what are the under-leveraged assets we're not thinking about that we could be using to give our students more global experiences? And the list they came up with was really interesting. Part of it led to the conversations about first-year residential halls. Part of it led to conversations about not just Columbus, but taking advantage of our proximity to the Appalachian region, another very culturally different experience for a lot of our students. The third was taking advantage of the fact that Denison, like many schools, is developing a very rich summer internship program and thinking about summer internships for students overseas or in places that have a kind of a cultural dimension to them. So it will vary for our campuses, but I suspect if on each of our campuses we pull together a small group that touch the campus in a variety of different ways, and we just ask the question, what are things we're not thinking about that we could be using to give more of our students a culturally rich, academically rigorous cultural experience? We'd be surprised what they find. And finally, for any and all of this to matter, I think this takes leadership. And I think that leadership needs to start, obviously, with the president, but I think it requires a whole campus. One of the reasons I was excited to come here is we represent a variety of different people working in higher ed. Faculty, deans, provost presidents, student development folks, and beyond. I actually think the leadership, we need to do this, happens at every level. It requires department chairs who are willing to free up faculty to develop new global programs. It requires deans who are willing to invest in faculty and staff development. So we just put a group of our student development folks on a plane, and some of them had never been outside the country before, and sent them overseas in preparation for welcoming this large class of international students. So I think none of this happens without leadership at every part of the college that will take on sacred issues, that will remove silos, that will free up faculty and staff time, and that will raise the money to make it happen. So I want to kind of wrap it up, and I actually thought since I was in Minnesota, I would quote one of my favorite faculty members, Ahmad Samatar, who some of you may know, who's at Macalester College. And Professor Samatar was at Denison a few months ago, and he made a comment to me that I've been thinking about ever since. He was drawing the distinction between big and small liberal arts colleges, and he was trying to make the argument that in tough fiscal times, when many of our campus conversations do revolve around things like student enrollments, right? They do revolve around things like course enrollments, all the things we've talked about today. It's very easy to slip into being a small liberal arts college, to become very insular, very internal looking, very focused on just whatever the immediate crisis or problem of the day is. My way of thinking about it as a former athlete is we can very quickly get back on our heels and in a defensive posture. And what Professor Samatar was arguing is that we need to embrace the bigness of who we are. That liberal arts colleges, if we're going to remain strong, need to embrace what is inherently wonderful about the kind of education that we provide. And that's the big liberal arts college. A liberal arts college that's outward looking. A liberal arts college that's immersed in the big issues of the day. A liberal arts college that's asking big questions about what kind of lives we want our students to lead. All those kinds of things that brought us into the liberal arts. From my perspective, that's what the conversation about globalizing the liberal arts is really about. It's about how do we, in a very challenging time, when every institution is facing very real challenges, how do we keep ourselves or prevent ourselves from falling into our small selves and embrace a bigger vision of ourselves in ways that's good for our students and good for our institutions. So why don't I end there? I'm happy to talk about any of that in more depth, but thanks for giving me a few minutes to speak tonight. Minutes as I could possibly do. Questions? Comments?
Adam, thanks for that. David Scobie. I'm about to note that I was surprised by something that I know you'll have a lot to say about and basically agree with it. I'm just sort of interested in your texture about good and bad practices, and that is the importance of international studies in the curriculum to the project of global education. You didn't tell us about area studies courses or course requirements or infusion in the curriculum. I know you must think that that's important, but I also know you probably have interesting discriminations about the best ways to do that.
Yeah, so thanks. Yeah, and I talk about it in the written version of the paper. So I would make two arguments. One, I think as somebody who went to a liberal arts college in the 80s, which is prior most international studies programs and most of the associated disciplines, I would argue that those programs have been hugely important in a variety of ways. One of which we don't talk enough about, at least at the colleges that I've been a part of. International studies has been a way for a whole generation of faculty who didn't necessarily think about themselves in international ways to expand their intellectual horizons. So, for example, at Denison, one of our international studies faculty actually was a German professor who's now, through his International Studies Association, has developed a intellectual interest in political economy. So I think international studies in particular is really important for a part of the project that I've come to care deeply about, which is how do we get more of our faculty on our campuses to begin to kind of think about whatever their intellectual interests are in more of their global perspective. So, I kind of hinted at it when I was talking. I think at Denison, and I suspect it's true at many of your schools, if we want a greater percentage of our students to have international experiences, we have to find a way to get our science faculty, right, somehow involved in the international project. So it's been through associations with international studies and something we call Denison Seminars, which are team-taught courses to faculty that has a study-away experience that a lot of our faculty are able to kind of stick their toe in the water and in some ways kind of reinvent themselves with a little bit more of an international bent. So for me, it's not just the international studies, but it's how do we do the ongoing professional development of our faculty? How do we give our faculty more opportunities at a variety of important points of their own professional careers to expand what they're thinking about intellectually in ways that might bring global issues and international experiences across our curriculum more?
Hi, Jillian Hiscock from College Possible. I love the emphasis on global education and 100% agree with you that many of our backyards are probably more diverse than a lot of our student study abroad experiences. I think that's true here in central Minnesota as well. I'd also be curious in hearing about how we can be more intentional about acknowledging the global experiences of some of our domestic students that come from recent immigrant families and that experience, and if that's different or should be treated the same way.
No, I think it's all part of the same. And for me, it gets back to something I said earlier. I think so. I was a sociology professor, right, and was enjoying what I was doing, and through a variety of things that happened at Colgate where I was at the time, I wound up spending a couple years in student development. And what was so striking for me, and I'll look at David as I say this because we knew each other back then. I was spending so much time trying to get students off Colgate's campus into the local community so we could teach them the skills, values, and habits of civic engagement, which for me is largely about how do people come together across difference to learn to do public work. Once I moved into student development, I began to understand I didn't need to get them off campus. We could do this with 100% of our students if we just began to think more creatively about residential halls. And it's the same thing here. I think when we look in our residential halls, what we see are all kinds of amazing international opportunities to engage our students in international issues and cross-cultural understanding that we're not taking advantage of. Some of it is international students coming abroad. A lot of it is our students coming from immigrant families, other parts of the country, right? The list kind of goes on and on and on. And we're not leveraging that. So for me, if all we did on our campuses was begin to kind of think creatively just about first-year residential halls, how we set a different tone, how we help students develop a different set of habits. If all we did was get students used to seeking out the people in the residential halls whose life experiences are most different, getting in the habit of getting really excited when they're in a classroom and somebody says something they find deeply offensive because they're going to get a chance to go out and have coffee with them, right? Those in and of themselves would be big leaps forward, and I think we grossly underestimate how many of those opportunities are on our campuses. We're just not taking advantage of them. So, no, I would put that in the same bucket.
Hi, I'm Jillian Kinsey from Indiana University and the Nessie Project. A comment and then a question. I'm really intrigued about your notion of actually playing off a bit of Paul's question about the curriculum and its role in globalization. 2 years ago on Nessie, we added a global learning module that we thought let's see what we can learn about global learning experiences, and it's been pretty highly subscribed for a new module on the survey. And we offered our first findings from this survey, very short, kind of asking about students' experiences, and discovered an interesting finding about the value of students who reported having courses that integrated and emphasized international kind of global perspectives. And after 2 years of data now, we actually discovered that when students have experiences that are have strong curricular emphasis, so a course or particularly a course that has an international global emphasis, it actually ends up almost equating to the same learning gains as students who have a global study abroad experience. And it was really pretty surprising to see that in the end, students described their gains in the same way as students who had only a study abroad experience. So the value of course-based experiences, I think, is really high if we do it well. Part of the big quality if we do it well. Dimension of kind of globalization. But it really suggested to me that we're also not leveraging enough of our curricular experiences. Robin Helms, who works as part of ACE, the American Council of Education Center for International and Global Education, or Global Engagement, got a hold of that finding and said, they're mapping internationalization results. A large effort as part of ACE suggested that there was insufficient emphasis on faculty in the curriculum in internationalization efforts in higher education. So we brought these two pieces together and thought, okay, we think we have something here. It makes a difference when students have this experience in their courses, and it's the aspect of internationalization efforts that get the least attention in higher education. It's all about student mobility and about internationalizing our faculty and internationalizing our student population, but we don't put enough emphasis. So I wonder if you have comments about how you're doing that with your faculty, if there's anything that you can report on that. And the other piece I'm really interested in hearing a little bit more from you is you've really emphasized the first year experience, and I think that's great, but where we see a real drop-off in international experiences is when getting beyond the first year. So if a student doesn't do study abroad, what do they have to look forward to? So sorry for the long response, but I wanted to get some information
great comments
out
and
there.
questions. You know, and I think your first point is well taken. Probably a comment both on the quality of teaching on our campuses and the quality of some of the study abroad experiences our students have, right? But I think the point is well taken. And I just, you just kind of play it out, right? I think about some of the examples of things going on our campus right now. Students taking an econ class who are doing a joint project with their peers at a college in Switzerland and I want to say it was college in the Middle East somewhere. And students paired up, right, jointly writing a paper on the changing global trends as they will transform the political economy of the Middle East, right? It's an incredibly rich experience. I think about some of the faculty and the life experiences, the intellectual traditions they're bringing into our classrooms that weren't on our campuses 20 years ago. And some of the courses our students now available to them are incredibly enriching in all the kinds of ways that you mentioned. So I'm a firm, when I first got interested in giving this talk, because when I came out of SIT, I was really convinced that one of the things we can do to dramatically transform higher education is to add more of a global component. But I was really struck by, we're not going to be able to send every student in the United States on an SIT program, right, for a whole lot of reasons. But as I began to spend time at Denison, I also began to realize that I was kind of looking for love in all the wrong places, that there were so many opportunities, both through the curriculum and co-curriculum, especially at liberal arts colleges. We are colleges that really could look parents in the eye and say, 100% of the students on our campuses graduate with pretty far along on the global literacy and global competency scale. And we know, right, we have good data to suggest that will increase their life satisfaction, their job success, right, and their ability to meet their civic obligations. That's a pretty powerful piece of the kind of narrative we're trying to kind of transform. And it's something that I don't think larger publics will be able to do as easily. So in terms of faculty, we've spent a lot of time thinking about, how do we give our faculty more opportunities? How do we do more professional development? And it runs the gamut, quite frankly. Some of it more expensive, right? So the Denison seminars we run, I think our faculty would argue, we've been doing them now for 3 years. Our faculty have done them, for many of them, they would say it's the most powerful professional development opportunity they've had. And so with two faculty, often it's somebody who has had a fair amount of global experience and somebody who hasn't, but they find a topic that they're jointly interested in, and they develop a course that has a global component. And so we have a group that went to Europe to study wicked problems, another group that went to England to study Shakespeare's Bones. What was interesting is it got a group of our science faculty really interested in global education in some interesting ways. The second is, we've just done more training with our faculty in trying to get them in some of our interdisciplinary programs. So we've developed a new global commerce program, and that's been really wonderful in getting some of our faculty who hadn't been necessarily thinking about what they teach in its global context, thinking about it in its global context. So, I don't think the leaps are that hard, quite frankly, but I think it requires leadership, not just at the presidential level, but I think the hardest thing at Denison has been the provost and I working with department chairs to free up faculty from the courses that the department chair really needs them to teach, to be able to have the time to pilot some new courses and to teach in some new areas. And those are challenging conversations. They tend to go better over a cup of coffee, and even better if we can offer to backfill the courses that faculty member won't be able to teach.
Well, thank you for this wonderful conversation. I agree with a lot of the important points that you pointed out, such as the quality of study abroad programs, the importance to give students access for them to study abroad. But in the recent years, I hear this, there's almost a confusion of the experience of really go to a country to immerse in that culture for a period of time, and almost as like a replacement to go to an immigrant neighborhood, try to study international engagement in an ethnic immigrant community. So I think there's value there, but I don't think that can really replace the rich experience of staying in another culture and see the people there. So for me, as a first generation international faculty, I feel, my goodness, to study Chinese culture in a Chinatown is so much off the point. But there's value to study a lot of things, including diversity, civic engagement in Chinatown, to bring that piece to the richness of American culture. But it's very different. That's really part of the American fabric. But I just want you kind of elaborate a little bit on that. Thank you.
No, I totally agree with what you said. So if I had my magic wand and resources were unlimited, and I had 4 or 5 things I could do, one of them would be to give every U.S. student a gap year abroad, where they would be someplace living with a family that didn't speak their language and that was culturally challenging in all kinds of ways. I think it'd be life transforming. The question for me is a couple-fold. One, it gets back to something that you asked that I didn't respond to, which is how do we give students multiple experiences at multiple parts of their educational experiences? One of the things that I've been interested in for a long time is how do we get more of our students, when they become juniors, to choose what I would call slightly more challenging study abroad programs, right? Programs that may be in places they find a little more challenging, places that may require them to use their language skills or learn a new language. And I've actually come to believe that having some of those experiences domestically as first-year students and sophomores may actually give students the confidence and the interest when they become juniors to try something that's a little bit more. So I don't think it's either or. I think it's both and. The other thing I've just been doing a lot of thinking about is, as hard as we try, we're never going to get 100% of our students to study abroad, right? So how do we then begin to kind of leverage and take advantage of other opportunities? But I think your point is well taken. I also think that's where it's incumbent upon presidents and others to try to raise more funds to support more students studying abroad. One of the things I worry about is even on our campuses that have a lot of study abroad, there are often students who can afford to do it and students who can't afford to do it. And how do we level that playing field?
Hi, I'm Lisa Scott, in college. I just want to continue that line of thinking.
Yeah.
So I think study abroad has different impact on different students. And so the experience of someone, and so I guess I want to just kind of agree with the last speaker that to get a passport for a first and family student, right, whose family has never no one in the family has ever been on a plane. And the risk-taking, so we know, for example, students of color, and risk-taking is an issue, right? And so to go abroad, so it's one thing to have come from a family where you've been abroad and the passport is normative, right? It's another thing, so for a first and family student to come to a campus that may tout study abroad, but because of finances cannot have what I think, I agree with the last speaker, is an incredibly rich experience, and coming from a community that themselves someone may identify as a community that other students might come to have a quote unquote kind of cultural experience. And so I just want to suggest that, and I guess I would really want to argue that it's possible to send 100% of students on campus abroad if that's where the campus decides to commit resources. So I don't know that I agree that it's impossible, right? I just think that if it's a value that we hold dear, because I think the minute that we say, well, some students go here, and we do that now, right? When we say 50% of our students, I'm an equity officer, so I want to talk about, so tell me about the 50% who don't, and what does that look like? Because we're talking about inclusive excellence. And so I don't think we get to inclusive excellence until we say, if you come to my campus and you do all the things that we say you need to do to go abroad, we can find a way to make that happen for you. I just want to suggest that study abroad is often posited as this thing that is a good thing, but not all students have access to it. But we, particularly in the liberal arts, want to hang our hats on it. But I think if we were to, across the liberal arts, unpack who doesn't go, we would see some patterns here, right? And we would see some issues here. And so I think we ought to be about making sure that the least of us, in particular, for who it is a game changer. So, and I'm not trying to suggest that it doesn't have impact for all students, but I think the game changer, right, is about the students who, for first and family, and all the things that are embedded in what it means to leave this comfort and to be in a place of disequilibrium and to figure that out for persistence issues right onto the PhD.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. Look, and I want to be careful because I realize I speak from a position of privilege in some ways, right? I'm the president of a college that has a large endowment per student, and a very, very strong net tuition revenue. So we have resources. So, we've made the commitment that for global programs, we're going to make sure that every student can afford to do it. We actually made a commitment with our new strategic plan that we wouldn't roll out any program on campus unless it was equally open to every student who wanted to do it. And I realize that we can do that. It's harder for other campuses. We're up to about 80% of our students having a global experience, some of them short, some of them long. But these are all resource issues, right? The first point you made, I actually really agree with. And one of the things that we've noticed over the last couple of years is we've been rolling out these Denison seminars for first-year students and sophomores, is for many of our students for whom, for all the reasons you mentioned, they probably would opt out of a study abroad experience. Having a very short experience their sophomore year greatly increases the odds that they will then turn around and opt in their junior year. It's for me why, there were lots of things that when I was at SAT I was really resistant to, short-term programs, study away programs, that I've now, as I'm a college president and watching the dynamics on our campuses, I've come to believe that I was wrong. And part of it is something you alluded to that I just kind of want to put out there. One of the great things about liberal arts colleges, or at least about Denison, is we've become remarkably diverse over the last 20 years. So there is no one-size-fits-all model. We have a range of different kinds of students, and we need a range of different pathways that meets the needs and desires of different kinds of students. It's part of what's fun about being on our campuses right now, from my perspective.
Let's give Adam a big round of applause. Thank you, Adam. I have to say I'm so impressed with all of you. You have been at it since early this morning, and your questions are great, and you've stayed strong with them all night. So thank you for a long day. There's 2 reminders I'm supposed to pass on to you. First of all, there will be suites right across the street in the St. John's Bible Gallery, which is in the Alcuin Library, and there are going to be people who will guide you to the right location as you head out of here. And secondly, we start at 8:30 tomorrow morning with a talk by the futurist Rich Karlgaard. You won't want to miss that, I don't think. I know I don't want to. So thank you all for a long and great day today. Enjoy a few sweets. Thank you.